Resuming debate, the honourable member for Hamilton East, Stony Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are times in this House where we touch on debates that actually we can speak to from times and periods in our own lives. And I was pleased to see the member for Kootenay-Columbia here, who is an RCMP officer who can bring to this debate a very clear perspective from inside of the organization. In my lifetime, as a young boy growing up in a town called Plaster Rock, New Brunswick, where New Brunswick had RCMP officers enforcing the law in our province, I had my family had occasion to deal with them. I had a situation when I was very, very young where my sister died at the hands of persons or persons unknown. It turned out to be a very ill family member. But the officer, the investigators from the RCMP that handled that investigation, my father talked about for an awful long time afterwards, because initially he was taken in for questioning and he talked about how professionally he was handled, a man who was broken-hearted, who just lost a daughter. And in fact, that particular incident would affect the rest of his life, and he became an alcoholic. And again, we would have interaction with RCMP officers who would pick him up from time to time, as they should, as they needed to do. But there was always a sense that they handled my father with a kind of dignity that perhaps they might not have under some other circumstances. I don't know. But for a young boy growing up, my ideal was to become an RCMP officer. Well, Mr. Speaker, if you look at me, I'm wearing glasses and I'm too doggone short to be an RCMP officer. So I had to forgo that. But I had this great interest in the RCMP for an awful long time, a great respect for them. I still respect the RCMP, Mr. Speaker, although they've fallen on difficult times. There's a cultural change that has happened, at least in my view, over the last numbers of years, relative to how they treat each other. And we've heard those reports. I recall, I believe it was in the 70s, where there was a group referred to as the Dirty Tricks Squad. And there was an investigation into that, and that particular group was disbanded, as I understand the circumstances. The warning signs were there for some time, Mr. Speaker, about the things that would later become almost institutionalized within the RCMP. If you go back to Justice O'Connor in the Mayor O'Rourke case, Justice O'Connor made some very significant recommendations to the RCMP at that time of things that they needed to address, things that the government needed to address. And that has gone wanting as far as I'm concerned. But you'll recall, Mr. Speaker, back in the last Parliament, I think it was, Bill C-38 started to address this, and of course it was lost in the election cycle, as so many things are. But again, going back to my friend from Kootenay-Columbia, who brings to this place a particular view of this institution and of perhaps the problems, perhaps some solutions. I'm certainly looking forward to listening to his commentary as the day unfolds. In my previous life as a union leader, one of the things that we had to deal with quite often was harassment in the workplace. And we would get together with the company and we'd work strategies for education of the members who were involved with such things. Within the union movement itself, I can recall in the 80s that we worked hard dealing with our own conferences, our own internal work, and the respect that needed to be paid to one another. And the key to it, Mr. Speaker, in both of those cases was education. And I have a little saying I use: with knowledge comes responsibility. We have the knowledge today of the accusations and the abuses that have been suggested have happened within the RCMP. We have enough knowledge that we know that there has to be something of significance done. So our party was concerned with this bill because our party felt it didn't go far enough. And, Mr. Speaker, during the committee stage, we made proposals for change to the bill, changes that, for instance, a change that's needed is to add a mandatory harassment training for RCMP officers. Every single individual needs to have that training who works with the public, who works under the kinds of pressure that these officers work under. Again, reflecting back on my own life in the workplace, there was a time I worked for the Canadian National Railway as a signal maintainer. And I would have some car hit, and I see a member, well, I'm not supposed to say I see a member in the House, so I won't, but in Niagara Falls, where I had my territory, there was a place called Thorlstone Road that members here, some members will know of. I had 4 people killed in accidents there, struck by trains while they're driving through. And my point is, day in, day out, our RCMP, our police officers, our fire departments deal with the aftermath of horrific events, car crashes. Reading just today in the newspaper in Hamilton because of the storm, there was a 6-car pileup. The first on the scene quite often is a police officer who has to deal with that, who has to deal with the pressures that come from those situations. You consider that pressure for a moment. That does not justify harassment, but in some cases it might help to explain it. It might help us to understand what their lives are like and the problems that they take home with them, in fact, Mr. Speaker. So if you come back to any situation in the workplace, you have to give your employees, those workers, the tools that they need to deal with those situations. And in the case of the RCMP, I would stress, and our party has stressed, the need for that mandatory training. We also believe that there should be a civilian body involved, somebody that's arm's length. Oftentimes, we are too close to issues and problems ourselves that we keep repeating the same mistakes and not addressing them in a fashion that is helpful to the situation. Whereas if you have a civilian board at arm's length who has the capacity to bring that different perspective to the situation, I think it's really important that the government should pause and look at this and give really serious considerations to implementing a civilian oversight. You know, the human resource policies that are, you know, in our view, again, that some of the policies we see are overly dramatic, perhaps even draconian in what they offer. But I'm not going to dig too far into that because I don't want this to become seemingly a debate or bashing of the RCMP. I want us to respect, again, myself and members of my party have a great respect for this organization. But we do need, part of our responsibility in this place is to do the right thing to help that organization make the corrections that are deemed necessary, and I would suggest deemed necessary by the government because they have made an attempt with this bill to start a process we don't think has gone far enough. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, witnesses that came before the committee made recommendations that the government didn't see fit to follow through any more than they did the things that were proposed by our party during the committee cycle. But you know, this bill was, as I recall, was just put forward in June of 2012. And it was called to enhance trust and restore accountability for the RCMP. Well, accountability will need the oversight that was talked about. It will need somebody at arm's length. Now, there's proposals in the bill to give more power to the superintendent in charge, to the officer with the number one officer with all of the authority. He's going to be given authority that perhaps goes on what I would call where due diligence should come into play. I'm a great believer in people's rights to be heard. There's people in the workplace, whether they be RCMP officers or regular workers in a plant, who make mistakes, do things wrong. And if you have an arbitrary situation where there's one employer who says you're fired. I worked for an employer, Bell Canada, who many times, in my opinion, fired people too quickly. They didn't even listen to the story in those days. Hopefully that has changed. It's been almost 20 years since I was there. But the reality is you would be called on the carpet, the accusation would be made, you're fired. Then you had to, along with your union, prepare a case to come back to correct the accusation, the thing that had been said. So in a workplace where there's that kind of power vested in one manager or one superintendent is very concerning. And especially when you have a situation like the one with the allegations or for the RCMP, that it talks about a systemic problem that has had to have developed over many, many years. And again, I have to take you back one more time to the pressure that these individuals live under. I want everybody to pause and think about it, because that, as I said before, doesn't justify misbehavior on the part of workers or officers, but we need to have a trail of due diligence that allows people to look at the situation, understand the situation, and help the officers retain their position and correct the behavior that people are having problems with. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have?
9 minutes and 15 seconds.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's very helpful to know. As I look through some of the statements that we have from our party, and in our view of some of the things that could happen, we need the minister to prioritize the issue of sexual harassment. To this part of my speech, I really haven't talked about it. That's the part of the story that's gotten a lot of media attention. In my experience, media attention sometimes makes a flashpoint of an issue where there's other underlying issues or related issues or cultural issues in an organization. They're kind of overlooked because the focus then is drawn so heatedly on that particular point. Sexual harassment in any form, in any place, workplace or otherwise, is certainly not acceptable, must be addressed. But again, as I said, the other underlying issues that are part of, well, if you look at the existence of police officers in general, the military-style training they have, again, referring back to myself, 1963-64, I was a sapper apprentice in the Canadian Army, and at that time, we had hazing that took place. It was considered part of becoming a soldier. You had to be tough enough to put up with whatever happened, whatever was done. Fortunately, the environment I was in did not contain any sexual harassment, but there was other forms of it. Over time, the military dealt with that. My understanding is that the world today in the military is entirely different. If you, again, go to the military-style training that police officers receive, the environment for that kind of culture is there, and it's just a very short distance between harassment or the buddy-buddy system where people are harassing in good-natured fun to carry it over when you introduce women into the force, that women's sensibilities relative to what men consider jokes are often greatly different. In most instances, greatly different. What a man may think is very humorous, a woman is tragically hurt by. And I want to repeat that, tragically hurt by, because they live in an environment where the male in the environment has the perceived power in many, many situations. And they perceive themselves as not having the power to push back. And if you listen to the accounts that have been made public by women officers in the RCMP, that's exactly what they felt was happening. They were marginalized, troubled by what happened to them. And when they went to superiors for assistance, they felt they didn't receive the respect that they deserved. But I'll take that back to the point, did that person they went to really have the training, the understanding, the development of the sensitivity for what the women were facing? Did they really truly understand? Because it's easy to say they neglected. It's easy to say that they ignored. But maybe, just maybe, it's perhaps they didn't have a true understanding of the damage being done. The reality is, though, Mr. Speaker, that we have to go back to the education. We have to go back to changing that system that has evolved in such a negative way. We have to give the tools to the RCMP as a whole to begin to address themselves this problem. Because you can't fix these things from the outside. You can start doctoring, you can put Band-Aids on, but until the culture starts to evolve itself. And again, sensitivity training of relationships between men and women in the workplace, or men and women, and as well another area is visible minorities, because that's another new thing within the RCMP. All of these things added to the day-to-day pressures that these good officers live under, and the culture that has sadly reached the point it's reached, a point where we have lawsuits, we have individuals going very public with their stories. And I can tell you from my own experiences as a representative in the trade union movement, the last thing a harassed person wants to do is make it public. Because to their mind, they're looking at that just like bullying in a school ground. They're looking at it from the point of view, well, they'll get me again, or they'll do it again, or I'll lose the respect of my co-workers. All of those things, Mr. Speaker, need to be addressed. Can I ask you again, Mr. Speaker, how my time is? Thank you. So, when this bill came before the committee, the NDP in good faith went there. We understood that we had to be addressing this situation. We cannot support the bill in its form because it has not gone far enough. Again, the idea that you can vest power in one person, that being the head of the RCMP, and say that person is going to create the environment, it's going to need exterior help. It's going to need experts in dealing with harassment situations, training experts to come in and assist the officers, assist the people within individual departments who are in charge of those departments. And there has to be a comprehensive training cycle put into place, or this isn't going to work. It took years and years and years for this to evolve. You never heard stories like this before, and it wasn't just a matter of people being silent. You never heard it because it wasn't happening. The pressures on modern-day police forces is beyond anything. Like, again, being a child of the 50s, I'm from the days where we didn't lock doors, we didn't lock cars, and we didn't have the environment. We weren't police officers of the day very, very rarely faced somebody with a firearm in their hand. So the environment they lived in was different. And again, I want to stress, I'm not justifying what happened, but I think it has to be part of the equation to understand what is happening to these officers, and a spillover effect of that evolving negative culture was that it got totally out of hand. And I'm of the understanding that there's many women RCMP officers who have come forward, and I would encourage all of them to come forward to understand that there's people who sincerely want to see change. We want the tarnished record of the RCMP to be corrected, but we also want those in charge of the RCMP to have the tools to create and sustain a healthy workplace. And, you know, I can't stress that part enough, because you probably can tell, Mr. Speaker, that I speak with a great deal of sadness, because, again, as I said earlier, my ideal was to one day become an RCMP officer. And a long time ago, that ideal, believe me, we're talking the 50s. So as a result of that, when I'm viewing the activity around this bill, the fact that the NDP went to committee with a sincere attempt to make the bill better, we can do better for our police force, for our RCMP police force, that we remain proud of these people who work so hard for us and put their lives at risk and live in an environment outside of their offices in the field that is very, very difficult. And sadly, within their buildings when they return at the end of a shift or before going out on a shift, there's a culture in there that's been stained, it's been tainted, and we have to do everything we can to fix that. And, Mr. Speaker, with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you very much.